This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, sponsored by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm Dahlia Schendlin. Gilad Halpern, unfortunately, is not with us today, but he'll be back. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom, click the big red button that says Patreon, and support us. We're counting on you. Every week, Gilad and I bring you interviews with authors of books and research, people who are producing knowledge about topics that we think are essential. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency in the second half of 2020, and the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries with their generous support. Our guest this week is speaking to us from Berlin. Dr. Muriel Asseburg is a senior fellow at the Research Division of Middle East and Africa at SWP, that's Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or otherwise known as the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Whichever name you use, it is one of Germany's leading foreign policy think tanks. Dr. Asseburg is a member of the Scientific Committee of the European University Institute's Middle East Directions Program, a member of the International Advisory Board of Mediterranean Politics, and in 2008, she was a guest researcher at the Carnegie Middle East Office in Beirut, Lebanon. We'll be discussing numerous papers and reports she's written very exhaustively on the Israeli Palestinian conflict and other stuff we haven't discussed yet about that issue, the Trump plan, Palestinian politics. She also writes on regional issues, including recent works on Syria. Muriel, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dahlia. Good to be with you.
Nice to have you. I want to start off broadly and ask you about the role that you play. Your work at this prominent think tank is heavily geared towards influencing the debate over European policy, EU policy. You are the first in our series to look at the Middle East more broadly. Up until now, we've focused very much on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we will get into Syria, but you also write about Lebanon and Libya and Yemen, Eastern Mediterranean. I want to ask if you can characterize any overall goals of the EU in the Middle East at large, or even one single goal.
Yeah, I think it all boils down to one single goal, and that is stability. Stability that keeps the problems of the region away from us and lets us profit from the good sides of the region. So, yes, we do want to have relations in terms of markets, trade, culture, tourism, but please do not have migrants come from the region, do not have terrorists come from the region, do not have conflict spill over into Europe. And so stability is the one and the overriding goal, as I would put it, of Europe towards the region.
That's a very compact answer. Do you think that goal differs at all for Germany, or does Germany's vision for the region completely overlap with EU countries, with the EU as a whole?
I would say there is a large overlap, and then some countries, because of the history, have different aspects that are more important to them. For Germany, definitely relations with Israel do play an outstanding role. For others, their relations with the former colonies play a larger role, and that is the case with Germany.
Okay. That's a good start. I want to start, again, by going outside of our region of Israel-Palestine. Sometimes it feels like, we live on our own little planet as if we're disconnected from the region, and of course we're not. Let's start with Syria, because you've been writing a lot about it recently. Regional dynamics of the Middle East in many ways revolve heavily around a few countries, but Syria, as you point out, is where the biggest power brokers converge. In one of your articles, you noted that no less than 5 countries have a military presence there. So what could go wrong? That's my first question. But I mean, what do you envision happening in this situation?
The problem is, or the sad thing is, that after all that has gone wrong over the last 9 to 10 years, horrible war with catastrophic consequences for the Syrians, still more can go wrong. So we're not safe. There is still contention between regional powers and international powers. And one of them is Israel, of course. And we have seen over recent weeks is an increase in Israeli attacks on Iranian targets in Syria, all the way to Iraq, actually, but also in Syria. And that holds quite a large risk of escalation. And we've already almost been to that point 2 years ago where have come to the brink of a direct military escalation between Israel and Iran. And that danger is not from the table. So there is not only ongoing conflict within Syria, but also between those powers that are involved in Syria. And that has a great likelihood of escalation, military escalation, beyond Syria.
Well, this really opens up the question of what stability is. I mean, just to consider it from the Israeli government's perspective, they're often making the argument that they must carry out these strikes, and I forget what number we're up to because there have been so many, because from their perspective, Iran getting a foothold in Syria would be a destabilizing factor in itself. So you're saying, but there's a destabilization if Israel and Iran come to the brink of war. How do you make the determination as to which kind of stability gets priority?
That's a very good question. In the end, I think what we have seen so far, that is an approach that has aimed at stabilization in Syria through military victory, is not going to provide stability for Syria and the region. What we're seeing is an approach that tries to take into account some regional and some international powers' interests, Russia, Iran, Turkey, in the framework of the Astana format.
Maybe you can explain what the Astana format is briefly for our listeners.
That's a format that Russia actually has invented, trying to get those powers that have most clout on the ground into a format, trying to manage the conflict and then achieve a military solution while at the same time safeguarding the interests of these powers. And they have seen that they have contradictory interests, but that they have enough overlap to trying to push the conflict into a certain direction. And that is what has happened over the last few years with the concept of de-escalation zones, where little, by concentrating forces on one zone at a time, the rebels in this zone have been starved and bombed into surrender. And then there have been so-called reconciliation agreements. And thus, step by step, the regime has taken over control of some 2/3 of the territory now. So that has been a process of supporting military victory of the regime. And that is an approach that, in my opinion, will not lead to stabilization of the country because of the nature of the regime and its uncompromising stances towards any kind of political inclusion in the country.
I mean, in one of your articles, you also raised the question about whether we can assume that Syria is even headed towards a future as a unified state under the re-entrenched Assad regime, or is there still a possibility of some sort of state disintegration? I mean, maybe that sounds extreme, but this question has been on the table. And where do you see things going now? I mean, as you point out, the regime has regained control over large parts. Does that mean it's a done deal? Syria will stay together under this repressive regime, or are there other paths? Not that I think they're great ones. I just want to ask you.
Yeah, I think there is seemingly contradictory trends. I think we will see, but much more slowly than envisioned, a reconquest of further territories by the Assad regime in the northwest, in Idlib, and in the northeast, where so far the Kurds mainly prevail. That will come, but not as quickly as the regime had thought and not as quickly as Russia had thought. And at the same time, what we're currently already witnessing is a destabilization in other areas of the country. We see renewed armed confrontations in the so-called reconciled areas in the southwest, in Daraa. We see protests basically across the country, small scale, but still protests against the government because of the lack of service delivery and the corruption. and bad governance in general. And that even takes place in regime strongholds. And we also see a renewal of attacks by Kurdish guerrilla groups and by remnants of the Islamic State. So I do see this parallel process of reconquering territory on the one hand and destabilization and erosion of state capacities on the other hand.
I mean, that sounds a lot of the grievances that began the protests to begin with in 2011, around the time of the Arab Spring. Are we seeing this kind of cyclical resurgence of the same original problems because the regime has not, has been busy fighting a war but not actually addressed the original grievances?
Yeah, this is absolutely what I see, and I think this is where we're headed. And the problem is that each cycle we go through, it's not only civil protests that come up, but also the remnants of jihadi terrorism that get stronger and that feed on the grievances of the people.
Well, it doesn't look like a very hopeful cycle. But what do you think is the way forward? I mean, if you were saying that the military approach of supporting, an extreme military victory by the regime is the current reality unfolding on the ground, and you don't think it's working so well, what is the alternative?
The alternative is a fantasy, and it won't happen. And that would be that we see what the UN is trying to achieve in Geneva, that is a negotiated settlement to the conflict, where we have a system of governance that is inclusive and participatory, where the rights of minorities are guaranteed. We have a political system in Syria where human rights are guaranteed. And we have a process of transitional justice that would lay the foundations for reconciliation between the opposition and the regime, but also between different population groups that have been manipulated, politicized, and instigated by confessional and sectarian rhetoric. That would be something that could actually lead to long-term sustainable stabilization. But we're not going to see that. That is not in the cards, I think.
Right. I mean, yeah. And this raised the question in my mind when I was reading your material, to what extent is this UN approach, which I think in many ways is shared by the EU, the idea of promoting, reconciliation, transitional justice, human rights, stopping human rights violations. Is this some sort of noble attempt to bring universal values to all the people of the Middle East that is ill-fated? Or, I mean, how do you see it? Is there, or is it simply the right thing to do but disconnected from reality? Is what I'm asking.
I think I would put it differently. I think the problem is that the Europeans have not created leverage for themselves. If they had created leverage through military presence, through diplomatic activity, through using their aid offers in a way that create leverage, then they might have had more of a chance to also have an impact on the conflict. But they have decided not to have an impact on the conflict. They have decided to really withdraw from conflict dynamics. And therefore, it seems that the goals they have, the strategies that they have, are completely detached from the reality on the ground. But I don't think, this is, if I may say so, an argument that I often hear in Israel, that Europeans are just so principled and, they have all these good values. But
this is exactly why I'm confronting you with this argument.
Exactly. I don't think it's only a normative approach. It's an approach that Europeans, and I'm among them, are deeply convinced that it's the only way of achieving sustainable stability.
So you're saying it's not just from our sentiment, it's in our interest.
It's in our interest, and it is also a matter of realpolitik. It's not that only military approaches are realpolitik. No. If you exclude people from the political system, if you trample on their rights, if you suppress them, if you torture them, you do not create stability.
Okay, it's a convincing argument to me. But I want to now move because in some ways I think some of this discussion is going to be relevant for, zooming in to this part of the world, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And, it does tap into the question of what Europe can do and how Europe sees the conflict. But let's start with some of the work you've done on Palestinian politics. It's something that I think we need to get deeper into, certainly on our show and in general, to understand the situation. Tell us about the political division between the Palestinian leadership. What is at the heart of this division in your analysis? Is it purely a power competition, resource competition, or is it more about the ideology between Hamas and Fatah? Is it a disagreement over tactics of how to confront the Israelis and fight occupation? How do you analyze that division?
It's a bit all of the above, but I would still say that at the heart of it is a power competition. It's a struggle about who benefits the most from the little that there is actually to benefit from. I mean, sometimes when I write about these issues, I feel it's almost sarcastic to say there is a struggle over power and control in Palestine, because there is so little to control. There are so little resources that the Palestinians have. There is so little territory that they control. Actually, there is no territory that they control. There is, if you want so, a power struggle about municipal services. But still, those municipal services hold some value that people try to profit from. And so this is the struggle about who can profit the most from these resources that are there and the privileges that are linked to these resources. And yes, that comes then cloaked in different ideology, in different strategy, in different ideas about how a future Palestinian entity should look like, and how much of direct or indirect cooperation with Israel is feasible or should not be done.
Yeah, this is. I sometimes think that reading, an analysis by a European, an outsider to this conflict, it sometimes, seems like you have access not just to different people, but to different angles that somebody who's writing either from the Israeli side or the Palestinian side will not really provide us. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say it's more objective because we all have our approaches, but I sense that in your analysis of Fatah and Hamas, each one brings up things that I'm not sure if we would see here from the typical sources that we Israelis and Palestinians, I guess, use. How do you see the dilemmas of, let's start with Fatah, because it seems like you really paint a spider web full of dilemmas that in any way they move, they seem to be trapped in your analysis. Can you explain some of those and tell us, how you arrived at your observations?
I think the main point is that, the PA stems or is the product of a liberation movement. And of course, the idea of Fatah always was to liberate Palestine from Israeli occupation. But then with the Oslo agreements, they decided on setting up a system of governance. And the more this system of governance tries to function and provide the services that they're supposed to provide to the Palestinian citizens, the more they are caged in the system of occupation, the occupation regime. And basically, there is no way out of this system. So the PA depends on basically everything on cooperation with the occupation regime. And that puts it into a very difficult dilemma because the rhetoric is one of liberation into a Palestinian state building, ending occupation, being free Palestinian citizens. The reality is that the PA has to function in cooperation with Israel in every field you can imagine for being in a position to giving services to its people. And that confronts it all the time with the accusations of its own people that it serves as a subcontractor to the occupation. And that robs it of legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinian people. And I think the element where that becomes most obvious to everybody, well, maybe not to everybody, but to Palestinians, is the field of security cooperation. And that is definitely also the field where there is where the PA is attacked the most on. Because Palestinians don't see security cooperation as serving their own needs. They don't see it as helping improve their security, but they see it only as helping Israel's security, the settlers' security, maybe also the regime security, the PA security. And thus it becomes completely a product of the occupation or an instrument rather of the occupation. And Palestinians criticize it very, very loudly. And that puts the PA in a situation where if they want to let out some steam, if that can be said like that, if they want to dampen this opposition a bit, then the PLO Central Council every once in a while decides that security cooperation with Israel should be scrapped, but it's just then not implemented because the PA cannot stop security cooperation with Israel. And it remains this tightrope walk for the Palestinian president and the PA that the rhetoric of liberation and the practice of cooperating with the occupation forces is always there and is always visible for all the Palestinians.
That's a very powerful contradiction, I think, that you draw. And it seems there was one more internal one that I found interesting in your writing, which is the sense that the reward system for the PA doing this cooperation and general coordination is an internal hierarchical structure because, the senior PA people then have access to permits and greater freedom of movement, and that creates a sort of deep inequality inside Palestinian society. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Absolutely. And that is something that has been discussed from the beginning, that when the PA was established and the Palestinian elites, the PLO elites, came back from Tunis and other countries, they got this VIP status and they were able to move. And suddenly they could build nice villas and they had access to monopolies, for example, in the telecom sector and in the trade, cement sector, and so on. And no wonder it's also the family of Mahmoud Abbas that is heavily involved in these kind of monopolies. And normal Palestinians, saw these villas springing up and they saw that some people can move and they cannot. And of course, that created a lot of grievances and it made these people look even more like subcontractors to the occupation, not in a situation or in a position to promote Palestinian interests, but focused very much on promoting their own interests.
Mm. And so why don't they rebel? It sounds very similar to the language in Syria. Grievances, a government that's not responsive, corrupt, not serving them. Why do we not see that kind of eruption among Palestinians?
It's an interesting point. I mean, we've seen seeds of rebellion also in 2011, as in other Arab countries. But of course, the situation in Palestine is completely different. There is no central place that Palestinians could congregate. They are all in their little cantons in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem. No way to unite. There is no way to focus on the Palestinian Authority as long as people perceive the occupation as the bigger problem. So it's difficult to rebel against your own people or your own leadership if you think that actually the main problem is the occupation and not the leadership. And the leadership is a secondary problem.
Right.
It's an instrument of the occupation and not the occupation itself. So those are two reasons.
Yeah.
I think there are more, but the situation is different than in other countries.
Right. Well, if that sounds complicated, I think your analysis of Hamas is even more complicated because you explain and you document how even though Hamas is, considered to be the sworn enemy of Israel, you point out a number of areas of indirect cooperation and I think you even assert that that serves Israel in a way. Doesn't Israel want to destroy Hamas, or does it not? What's this indirect cooperation that you have observed?
I don't think that Israel wants to destroy Hamas. I think Hamas serves a purpose for Israel. And it is exactly this situation where Israel and Hamas don't recognize each other as legitimate governments or as having legitimate governments, but they still deal with each other. I mean, Israel still accuses the de facto government in Gaza to do this and that, and they hold them accountable for observing certain red lines, and the other way around. And as you know, currently there are negotiations going on, more or less direct talks between Israel and Hamas about prisoner releases. So there is a de facto recognition of authority between the two. And I think with Hamas, it's even more startling in a sense that you have this strong rhetoric of resistance and of liberation on the one hand, but then you have an authority that knows very well that the population in Gaza does not want another war, does not want to see more bombs. So they work on ceasefire arrangements with Israel. They work on preventing radical groups from launching rockets. They do patrol the border fence so as to prevent infiltration into Israel. They suppress Salafi jihadi groups in the Gaza Strip. And in that sense, they render a security service to Israel. Now, they don't do this because they are a friend of Israel, but in their own interest.
Right.
And the own interest that is, once again, that maintaining power over this tiny strip of land is more important to them than fighting and trying to liberate that land. So they cooperate indirectly with Israel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we have to touch the toxic third rail of the conflict at this moment, because I think we haven't really discussed it on our show at all, which is the Trump plan. You have been thinking about the Trump plan for much longer than the Trump plan has actually existed. You wrote a report about it last April. The plan was only published this January. And you had anticipated quite a bit of it. What are the things that you thought that stand out for you about this plan that you believe are reflective of the American administration or the Israeli administration, certainly somebody's interests? What does this plan do? Whose interests does it advance?
I think there is two major issues that stand out with this document. One is the framing, the wording. This is a narrative of the Israeli right. There is no place whatsoever for the Palestinian narrative, for the Palestinian interests, for Palestinian rights or ambitions. And if anybody wants to pursue conflict resolution in any place, this is definitely not a document that could be a basis for conflict resolution, only when looking at the wording of the document. And the second one is the content. And the content, I think, turns the idea of a two-state solution upside down in everything. It basically takes up all the elements that were discussed in earlier visions for a two-state settlement, and it turns them on their head. That goes with regards to Palestinian sovereignty. The way that sovereignty is limited in that document means that if that were implemented, definitely there wouldn't be any meaningful Palestinian state. Rather, what we would see is a continuation of occupation, open-ended occupation, plus annexation of some 30% of the West Bank. Then the document violates basic principles of international law, and of course, first and foremost, the principle of inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force.
Otherwise known as annexation.
Right.
Well, we have some disputes over terminology here because, many of the Israeli leaders, including the prime minister and most of his ministers, are talking about extending sovereignty. And they don't use the word annexation. So I'm just, putting that out there as part of the debate here in Israel. But what you're talking about, acquiring territory by force, is annexation. Do you think there's any difference between those two terms of reference?
I'm not sure if there is a legal difference between the two. It seems to me when we had this discussion last year, when the Trump administration recognized annexation of the Golan Heights, they went further than Israel had gone before, right? Because Israel also said they hadn't annexed the Golan Heights. They had just extended sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
I think the letter of the law is extended Israeli law and jurisdiction. So Israel is very cautious about that because they don't even say extend sovereignty. The Golan Heights law from 1980 says law and jurisdiction, but that is de facto annexation because Israel governs there, and it used to be Syria.
Absolutely. And the signal is very clear. The signal is this is not open to negotiation. This is not open for anybody else to govern here. We will govern that, which in bracket doesn't mean that in the future somehow you could negotiate about it, right? Because even after annexation of the Golan Heights, there were negotiations with Syria over it. But as I would say, not really in good faith. But
right.
Putting that aside, this is about annexation, yes.
But that raises an interesting point. I mean, the Trump plan, okay, you think it's problematic in many ways, certainly for the two-state solution. Is it reversible if any of it is implemented? And, the government is currently discussing beginning legislation on July 1st, just coming right up. If Israel moves ahead with that in some sense, could these processes be reversible in a future peace process?
In theory, yes. In practice, I don't see it. Because with every step you take to entrench control over a territory, transferring population into that territory, building your infrastructure in a way that it links up to your territory and doesn't integrate into the territory you're talking about, you increase the cost for taking that back. And I would say that has been the whole approach to the settlement building issue all along since 1967, that step by step you have increased the cost for taking it back. You don't create facts on the ground to take them back afterwards. You create facts on the ground to entrench your presence there. So in theory, yes, everything can be taken back later, but it's not going to happen. And the costs will be enormous for any Israeli government to fall back behind what is promised in the Trump plan. And it will also be enormous for any American administration to fall back behind what has been promised in the Trump plan.
You're saying even if there is a Democratic victory in the U.S. and they want to change the policy that Trump has laid down, it will be difficult. They will have many constraints on reversing that policy.
Absolutely. Right. And I think you have heard what the presidential candidate of the Democrats has said. He has made very clear that he would try to improve the relations with the Palestinians, reopen a consulate in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians, restart aid support for the Palestinians. But he would not reverse moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for example. And it would be much more difficult for him to reverse the decision on annexation, even though he says he is against annexation, but he hasn't spelled out what that means.
Right.
And I don't expect him to spell that out.
Okay, well, let's ask you, we have to start wrapping up, so I'm going to ask you the question we've all been waiting for, which is what should the EU do about this? And I'll guide you a little bit because you've written about this based, I think you've outlined principles that you think could guide EU policy, even if I don't think there's a magic bullet, but maybe you do think there's a magic bullet. And maybe you can tell us about the principles you think should guide the EU. And if you have a magic bullet, this is the time to reveal it.
No, there is no magic bullet. But there is, of course, the possibility for the Europeans to take a decision if they do want to play a role or if they don't want to play a role in this. And of course, their room for maneuver is quite small now. The way the stars have aligned, right-wing government coming into being in Israel, the Trump administration, support of the Arab Gulf states. So it's not as if the Europeans are in the center of the action. They are very much at the margins of the action. But they can make a difference if they decide they want to do that. Because they have close relations with Israel, and they have instruments with which they could, if they wanted so, influence the cost-benefit analysis of those who take decisions in Israel. They have an association agreement with Israel that could be suspended. They have the possibility of recognizing the Palestinian state in the 1967 borders. They could even impose sanctions on the government of Israel, in brackets, as they have done with Russia when Russia annexed the Crimea. They could be much more consistent in their efforts at differentiating between Israel proper and occupied or annexed territories. And that could mean banning settlement products in Europe.
Which is very far from the situation we have now. We should point out there are labels, but nothing even remotely like banning products at present.
All what I have been saying right now, the options that the Europeans have are very much far from what the EU 27 will be able to agree on. Mm-hmm. So we will see maybe strong statements echoing what we have heard from the EU representative, foreign policy representative so far. But spelling out the consequences, I'm not so sure if European member states can agree on that. But you asked me of what they could do or if they could have an influence.
Right.
And what I'm trying to say is they could if they decided so. If they don't want to decide on measures that could actually affect the thinking of the government of Israel or make the government rethink once more if they want to go ahead with this or not. Maybe I should also not say the government, but this has been very clearly limited to Benjamin Netanyahu, right? The cabinet doesn't even have to agree to that. Mm-hmm. So it's this person and maybe the Knesset that has to be impressed by action. If this doesn't take place, then at least Europeans should do one thing, and that is to make sure that if Israel goes ahead and annexes areas or thinks that it can permanently occupy areas, then it has to grant citizenship rights to the ones who live in this area. This is the only acceptable way of Europeans if annexation goes ahead. And there is no way of maintaining a system where you have different rights and privileges in areas under your control if that is not limited and temporary because of a military situation.
Mm-hmm. I want to end by recapping the principles that you spelled out at some point that are kind of, I saw them at least in your reports, as underlying values that guide this policy. And I think, at one point you said that the principles that the EU should adopt for its policy thinking is the right to national self-determination, individual rights of all people from the river to the sea, and right of return in a way that respects the interests of states in which they will be resettled. Do you think that those should still be the guiding principles? I think you wrote that not too long ago. Do you stand by these as the right direction for European policymaking?
Absolutely, but these are principles when you talk about a conflict settlement, right? Any conflict settlement would have to abide by these principles or would try to implement these principles in order for it to be a sustainable and legitimate arrangement. But we're not headed towards conflict settlement. We're headed towards a situation of increased conflict and of entrenched situation of lack of justice. And therefore, yes, these are the principles that need to be implemented if we talk about settlement. And I think what now is important to at least not shut the door to that permanently.
Right. Okay. So you're saying we can hope to one day get back to a conflict resolution process. I'll have to leave it at that. But Dr. Muriel Asseburg from the SWP think tank in Berlin, thank you so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Dalia.
Thanks also to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us exactly what you think. You can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter, too. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.